All right, I don't know if I'm on yet. I don't think so. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, well, hey, good evening, everybody. I know it's not quite 6 o'clock, but it is close. And we want to get going because I think we'll be here a little while. And there is a big hockey game that I know everybody wants to get home for. So this might be one you don't want to miss the first minute. We'll see. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should. You're not a patriot if you don't. No, USA versus Canada tonight. We take their national game from them. It'll be great. All right. Welcome, guys, to the deep dive. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with prayer, and then we're going to dive into Genesis, all right? Father, thank you so much for your love to us. Thank you for the freedom that we have to come together on a night like tonight just to talk about your word. And I pray tonight as we do that this will be a good chance for us to just get to know you a little bit more through the words that you have revealed to us. Thank you for this church, and thank you for the great way that you have used this church to change people and to make each of us more like you. In your name, amen. All right, well, we are tonight doing Answers from Genesis, and I'll just real quick give you an overview of my plan for the evening, all right? I'm going to address kind of 4 topics tonight, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have enough time for lots of questions if you have them. The 4 topics that we're going to hit on are really only going to take us through about the first 7 chapters of Genesis. There's 50. But they're really the stuff that we've kind of skipped over in our study to this point. So we're going through the Old Testament this year, and we're really doing it character by character. So we started off with Adam, then we're on Abraham right now. We'll get into Joseph next. So the first 3 months, a quarter of the year, we're spending in Genesis. That's how important the stuff in Genesis is. Tonight, 4 topics we're going to hit on is creation and evolution. And then we'll talk briefly about Cain, just because there's some really good questions that people have about Cain. Then we'll get into talking about who are the Nephilim and what's the deal with that, because Genesis 6 is one of the most outrageous chapters in the Bible. And then we'll finish up talking about the flood and whether or not it actually happened and how big it actually was. And then we'll have time for questions. And if you have questions, as always, you can ask questions about any part of Genesis. You can ask any other questions. And honestly, you can ask anything you want. And as long as it's reasonable, I will do my best to answer it. But there are times the answer might be, I don't know. So if you do have questions, you can text them to that number. You can do that at any time during the evening. I probably won't look at my phone until the end of the night. By the way, that's not my number. Okay, and I'm telling you that because if you try to text that number later thinking you're texting something to me, I will not see it. All right, I'll see it tonight. Then I won't see it again until the next deep dive, which does happen sometimes. Like, pull the number back up on my phone to get ready for a deep dive. I'm like, oh, this was a question from the last one. So let's remember before we get going, one of my favorite quotes from Alistair Begg, the plain thing is the main thing, and the main thing is the plain thing. Tonight we are talking about the unplain things, and that means they are the unmain things. Fun discussions to have, right? They're helpful for us to understand the bigger picture of God's Word. And some of the things we're talking about are really great because they help us to have more confidence in who God is, which builds our trust, which builds our maturity. But at the end of the day, everything we're going to talk about tonight is the kind of thing that we can say to each other, hey, I don't see it the way you see it, and that's okay, right? We can have disagreements on these things. We can have different kinds of disagreements on these things, and that's okay, because at the end of the day, the main thing is that Jesus is the only way of salvation, right? And nothing that we talk about tonight, at least don't think so, is going to impact that, all right? So, having said that, here's my plan. With each of these topics we cover, I'm going to try to hit it from 2 different angles. I'm going to start most of the time by talking about simply what does the Bible say. Right? One of our core beliefs at the Gathering is that we trust the Bible. We believe that the entire Bible is inspired by God, that it's all true, it's infallible. We believe that it is internally consistent, and so we can use parts of the Bible to help us understand other parts of the Bible. We'll do a bunch of that tonight. And then we're going to look at the questions and say, now, having said that, let's just talk this through rationally. Try to use logic. Think about history. a little bit of science, not a lot. You guys know I'm terrible at science. And so I will be very careful about how much science I try to talk about because I will undoubtedly get it wrong if I do. All right? So let's get going. First question, does God exist? And is the earth old or young? Right? And this is the creation evolution question. So did God create the world, or did the world just kind of come into existence? Now, let's just go right away. I'm going to skip and then come back here. Let's see. There we go. All right. Don't worry. I'm going to come back and hit all those. Genesis 1:1, the first verse in the Bible, makes a huge assumption, doesn't it? It says, in the beginning, God. It doesn't try to prove the existence of God. It just simply assumes the existence of God. So when we talk about creation versus evolution, we recognize that the Bible has this assumption that God exists, but not everybody shares that assumption. In fact, one of the reasons people really like the theory of evolution is because it provides an answer for how all this happened without God. And so if you don't believe in God, you need a way to explain how we got here. That's why that works. So we're going to try to answer that question, does God exist? We're going to try to answer this question, is the earth old or young? And we'll talk about why that's a question as we go. Now, you're going to see this a lot tonight. And what this is this is a QR code. This is going to take you to a YouTube video, all right? This sermon series is one that we did, I think, in 2021. Does anybody remember this sermon series? And a lot of you are here for it, so that is just such a boost to my ego. Nobody remembers it. All right, so this was back, I think it was in 2021. I might be wrong. It might have been 2020. I'm not 100% sure. But this was a sermon series that we did on the first 12 chapters of Genesis. So you're going to see this several times, and I'm going to say, here's a sermon that I preached several years ago where I'm talking about what we're talking about right now. So this is me talking about Genesis 1 and creation versus evolution. Some of the things I say tonight will sound the same as that sermon, and this sermon will give you a little bit more perspective and a little bit of a different perspective. So if you want to go back and look. Now, John did great work today for us. He went onto our YouTube channel and created a playlist. So if you know how to get around YouTube, you can go to our YouTube channel, hit playlists, and there's actually a First Things First playlist. You can watch the whole series right there. So you guys thank John for that. He did an awesome job. When we talk about creation and evolution, this is really, more than anything else, a question of perspective and starting point. All right? So I look at the world around me, and I have to decide, what does the evidence say? All right? So some people will say, David, there's no God because there's no evidence for God. Right? It's like, okay. I would say there's a ton of evidence. I would say everything is evidence. Now, we're both looking at the same world, right? They're looking at the same trees as me. They're looking at the same animals as me. They're looking at the same people as me. They're looking at the same sun, moon, and stars as me. We're both looking at the exact same thing and drawing completely different conclusions. Their conclusion, all of this is evidence that there is no God. My conclusion, all of this is evidence that there is no God. It's completely a question of perspective and starting point. I came across a great poem this week. I love this. Grandpa dropped his glasses in a pail of purple dye, and when he put them on again, he saw a purple sky. What does that mean? Well, if my starting point is that God exists, then everywhere I look, I will see evidence that God exists. And if my starting point is that God does not exist, then everywhere I look, I will see no evidence that God exists. So let's try to narrow this question down as much as we can and make it as simple as possible. There are two positions. God exists, God does not exist. You either believe that there is nothing more than what we have around us and what we can observe, or that there is something else. That's it, right? It's either there's nothing more. The only things in existence are things that we can see, measure, whatever. Now granted, we're seeing more and more. We go deeper into the oceans, further into the universe. Whatever we can see, whatever we can measure, that's all there is. There's nothing more. We're alone in the universe. Or there's something more. And that's really the argument that we have to figure out which is right. This brings us back to Genesis chapter 1, okay? Genesis chapter 1 makes the assumption what? That there's something more. That we have the world, but the world is created. Therefore, there's something before the world. Something existed before us that got everything started. Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of the world's premier astrophysicists. He's a super smart guy. He's much smarter than me when it comes to science, all right? And so I'm not going to pretend that I know more about science or physics or any of that stuff than he does. He's written some really good books, some really detailed books. Probably the book that he wrote where he talks the most about how everything happened is a book called Origins, right? It's about how everything happened. And it's actually a really good, interesting read. I didn't understand a lot of it because he's using terms that I don't understand, but I did understand enough to be able to grasp his idea of how everything started, okay? And I found some of the things he said absolutely fascinating. I want to walk you through this, okay? So this is an astrophysicist who absolutely does not believe that God exists. Absolutely does. In fact, he's very vocal about that. This is what he says. What happened before all this cosmic fury? The cosmic fury is the start. So the Big Bang, and there's heating, and there's cooling, and there's expansion and contraction and all that, and it happens in these unmeasurable periods of time. I won't go any more detail than that, but he says, what happened before all this cosmic fury? What happened before the beginning? This is the ultimate question, isn't it? This is the nothing more or something else question. Before the Big Bang, before all this started, what happened? And this is the answer. Astrophysicists have no idea. It's like, we don't know. We have no answer to that question. Rather, our most creative ideas have little or no grounding in experimental science. That's a really important statement. I'm so glad he makes this statement because he recognizes what science is. Right? Science is actually this theoretical thing where we're always trying to prove that we're wrong. And so we experiment and experiment and experiment and experiment. And if we can't experiment on something, then we can't figure it out scientifically. So we actually shouldn't call it science. So I would make an argument right here that when we talk about origins, it's not actually science. Because however things got started, no one was there to observe it. It is not repeatable, and we cannot do experiments. So we really can't figure this out scientifically. Now physics, they're using mathematics, and I don't even, it's weird, but they're trying to use mathematics to go back and figure all this out and using the laws of physics to figure out how things stopped and how things started. And they're looking out into the universe where we can see new things now and how the universe is expanding or seems to be expanding and trying to draw conclusions from all of that. And at the end of the day, here's their conclusion. We have no idea. Because our way of doing science doesn't help us understand the origin of the world. Now, he says, our most creative ideas have little or no grounding. Here's some of his creative ideas. What if the universe was always there? In a state or condition that we have yet to identify. So he said, what if the universe is eternal? And just in like something that we can't understand. A multiverse, for example. Like, this is like the Spider-Man thing where all three come back together and, fight the bad guys. Or something like that. Like maybe it was a multiverse in which everything we call the universe amounts to only a tiny bubble in an ocean of suds. I'm not 100% sure the picture he's making here, other than he's saying everything that eventually made the universe is contained in this really small thing that we can't describe, that we can't even imagine, and we can't think about. But trust me, it's a good idea. That's kind of what he's saying here. Or what if the universe, like its particles, just popped into existence from nothing we could see? When I first read this book several years ago, this was the point where I almost just put it down and said, really? Like, I read this because I really want to know what this really smart astrophysicist has to say about how the world began. And his conclusion is, well, it just popped into existence. Poof, there it was. That is kind of what God did. We're going to get there in just a second. So here's what he says then. He goes on. This is now where he says, you guys have to take this as a good answer. And here's why. The universe always was gets no respect as a legitimate answer to what was around before the beginning. Okay, do you understand what he's saying there? Like if I go to him and I say, okay, Neil, what was around before the beginning? And his answer is, the universe always was. He's saying nobody respects that as an answer. Okay, but he says for many religious people, that's us, the answer, God always was, is the obvious and pleasing answer to what was around before God. Now, he seems to make a point here, doesn't he? Because he says, almost like he's saying, we're holding him to a standard that we don't hold ourselves to. Because what we're saying is, hey, look, you can't just say the universe was eternal, but I'm going to say that God is eternal. Now, hang with me, because I'm going to make an argument that he's wrong on that, okay? I think he's actually drawing a false parallel between those two arguments, but we'll get there in a second, all right? Let me show you one more quote here. This is from Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager is a Jewish guy. He is not a Christian. He doesn't believe in Jesus. He doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. He has a series of commentaries and books that are called the Rational Bible. They're basically commentaries about the Old Testament from a Jewish perspective. And they're super helpful. So I have several of them on my shelves. I really like his Genesis one. Here, I'll show you this. So if you want to get it from Amazon, there it is. If you downloaded the notes, you can download the notes right there. Then you can get an Amazon link that you can just click on there, and you can see it. But here's what Dennis says. Dennis says, if God were created, God wouldn't be God. God's creator, we'll call him God's dad. Oh, I have a typo. Man, I don't get to do this again. We'll call him God's dad, would be God. But the same people who ask, who created God, would then ask, who created God's dad? Do you see how that works? And it just goes on and on and on. And the point that Dennis is making here is, somewhere there has to be something or someone that is eternal. Okay? There has to be something or someone that is eternal, because we can't just infinitely go back and say, well, who is God's dad? Well, who is God's dad's dad? Who is God's dad, right? And now, so here is where we and the atheist agree. Because this is where Neil deGrasse Tyson is also. Somewhere there has to be something that is eternal. That unstarted starting point, right? The unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. There has to be something like that. So this is the question. Is there something more, or is there nothing else? Right? That's where we started. Now, let's just say there's nothing else. Okay? That's the atheist opinion. What we have here is all that we have, there's nothing else. If there's nothing else, then what is that eternal starting point? Nothing. Do you see? I mean, I know I'm playing a word game here, right? But it's a powerful word game because it actually means something. If I say there's nothing else, but I also say there's something eternal before all of this, then that something eternal has to be the nothing else, and now I start with nothing. That makes a whole lot less sense than saying there was something, right? So if my starting point is there's something more, now I have to define what that is. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for a religious person, a theistic person, not necessarily a Christian, right? Because the Muslims would make this same argument, the Jewish people would make this same argument, even some other Eastern religions would make this same argument, that whatever that first eternal thing is, whatever it is, that's God. Okay? Now we all define what or who that is differently, but that's God. Now let's talk about what that eternal starting point has to look like, okay? So, let's do this first. It's more fun. If this is your starting point, okay? If this is your starting point, that there's nothing more. There's 4 assumptions you have to make that really take a lot of faith. Okay? I have to believe that something came from nothing. Okay? I have to believe that. If there's no eternal starting point, then I have to believe that something came from nothing. Secondly, I have to believe that movement began without influence. Imagine, I've used this illustration before, but none of you remember the sermon series, so I can use it again. Imagine that I had a football up here, right? And I'm holding the football right here. And I say, everybody close your eyes. And while your eyes are closed, I throw the football to Jim, and he makes an amazing catch. And then I say, open your eyes. Now, I'm standing here, and I don't have a football. Jim has the football now. Every single one of you knows exactly what happened while your eyes were closed, don't you? You know that I threw the football to Jim, and he caught it. Nobody opens their eyes and says, what in the world just happened? How did that ball get from David to Jim? Mind blown. Nobody says that because everybody gets it. When an object moves, something moved it. This is like a law of thermodynamics or something, isn't it? That objects in motion stay in motion, objects at rest stay at rest, unless moved upon by an outside force. If you believe that we start with nothing more, then you have to believe that movement began without influence. Because whatever caused that big bang were things colliding, moving. And that had to move without influence. Third thing is you got to believe that order came from chaos, and everything we know about the universe tells us that's not the way it works, right? But that's what you have to believe because we are incredibly orderly beings, and somehow we came out of the primordial ooze, right? Order from chaos. Number 4, you have to believe that life came from non-life. Somehow, even if you say, hey, I'll give you all of this stuff that you had rocks, but I mean, just think about that. Rocks themselves are a miracle because you start with nothing, a rock is something. But somehow rocks and water made us. Life came from non-life. So this is not a, I don't have enough faith to believe in God question, is it? This is, I don't have enough faith to not believe in God. Because everything I know, everything I observe in the universe, everything I understand about science, and it's not a lot, I acknowledge that, but everything I understand about science tells me that something can't come from nothing, movement cannot begin without being influenced, order cannot come from chaos, and life cannot come from non-life. I don't have enough faith to believe that there's nothing more. So let's talk about something else. If there is something else that is behind all of this, what does that something else have to be like? Well, it has to be personal. What does that mean that it has to be personal? It has to be personal because it made relational beings. Does that make sense? Like whatever that is that did something, here we are. And so there's something about us that is something like that. So we know that is personal. We know that it is intelligent. It has to be intelligent because there's no way that the order we see, the sun rising and setting. I know it doesn't really, we go around it, I get it. The sun rising and setting, right? Asteroids not crashing into us all of the time. The fact that I can just walk around on this stage with all of my muscles and joints and tendons working together while I'm talking to you, and I'm just emitting sound waves, you understand that? And they're getting piped through this thing, and your guys' ears just know how to pick those up and interpret them. That is crazy stuff. It has to be an intelligent designer. He has to be intentional. This is the movement, right? Just to set everything in motion. At some point, the eternal something made a decision to set everything in motion and make it happen. And I would argue, and we're not going to spend a ton of time here, go back and watch the sermon, I would argue that eternal something is relational because we all understand what love is. Evolution can't account for love. We all know what love is. How is that possible? And I would say it's because we have a relational creator. So, I believe in God. I believe that God exists, not because I'm a person of faith, but because I don't have enough faith not to. Like for me personally, the logical assumption of everything I know is that there has to be a God. And I believe that that's the God that created us. All right, so let's dive into the second piece of the question. Is the earth old or young? Now we're going to just get into it. We're just talking in our camp, okay? So this is people who believe in God, who believe that He's the creator, and who believe the Bible. And now we're asking the question, did God create the earth in 6 24-hour days or not? And the question here, here's the big question. Do we use the Bible, or do we use science to explain the Bible, or do we use the Bible to explain science? And here's why I'm putting it in those terms. The reason some people aren't sure about a 6-day, 24-hour creation, some people, is because science tells us that's not possible, right? Science tells us and gives us lots of evidence, says, no, the world is really, really old. Like, I don't know, how old, like billions, trillions, gazillions, lots of years old. And creationists have generally said, no, it's a lot younger than that. Now, there are some people out there who are like 6 or 7,000 years, and some are like 10 or 12,000 years. I don't think we need to put a number on it if you're a young earth creationist, but I think, the idea is that those first 6 days are actually literal days. Some people say, well, I'm not sure about that. How do we figure this out? So let's go back to Dennis just for a quick second, all right? Again, here's where a Jewish perspective is really helpful for us. Why? Because Genesis was originally written to the Jewish people. The reason Moses wrote Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, was to help this new nation that just came out of slavery understand who they were and who God was, right? They've been in Egypt for 400 years as slaves, and now this Yahweh God has rescued them. They don't know anything about him. They got to learn who he is. What's our story? Where are we from? And so Genesis is really Moses' way of saying to the people of Israel, this is who you are, this is where you're from, this is who you worship, right? So when we read stories about Abraham, they're learning about their forefathers. And when we read Genesis 1, they're learning about who this God is that rescued them. That's why it's really helpful to get a Jewish perspective. This is what Dennis says. Genesis 1 does not seek to teach science. I would 100% agree with that statement, okay? The point of Genesis 1 is not to teach science. It seeks to teach wisdom. I'm pretty good with that, too. I think there's more. I think it also teaches theology, but, his background has that. It says, while the present generation knows more science than any generation in history, I believe it possesses less wisdom than many preceding generations. I'm not going to be the get off my lawn guy tonight, okay? But I think he's spot on. I do. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but I do think that we are seeing generationally less and less wisdom. And why is that? Because the biggest single reason is that it has decided that God, the Bible, and religion are not necessary and that only science is. I think this is a powerful statement, and it should challenge us when we think about Genesis 1. That we should not throw Genesis 1 out because of science. When we do that, the message we're giving to the next generations is what? Science is more trustworthy than the Bible. Now, as we go through this tonight, I'm going to make an argument that this is not science against the Bible. In fact, that I actually think that the Bible and science are a lot more compatible than most people will say they are. But I just want to say, I think that it's important for us to recognize we don't want to throw Genesis 1 out because of science. Now, having said that, there are some arguments for old earth creationism. And I think there's some legitimate arguments, okay? So here we go. What's the first argument? First argument is the meaning of yom in Hebrew. That's not yawn, that's yom. And yom is the word for day, okay? So here's a starting point for some people is to say, when the Bible in Genesis 1 says day, it doesn't actually mean 24-hour day. It means a period of time. And so what they're getting at is that, sure, God created the world, and he created the world in 6 days, but those days are actually periods of time. And you might make an argument to say, the Bible verse that says that a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years. So maybe they were each 1,000 years long. And essentially the argument here is that God used the evolutionary process within these long periods of time each day to bring the earth into existence. That's why when scientists and geologists look at the world and they have the evolutionary record, that's why they can say, well, the earth is super, super old. And because those days weren't days. Now, to understand this, I'll just show you a couple verses. Let's see, 1 Kings. I'm just going to read this so you don't have it on the screen. But first, oh, man, I'm sorry. So this is the problem. I brought this Bible because it's my Genesis study Bible, and it's got all my notes. So if you guys ask me questions I don't have the answers to, hopefully they'll be in my notes. but also the print is really small. So, all right, so this is 1 Kings 11:42, and it says, "The length of Solomon's reign in Jerusalem over all Israel totaled 40 years." You're like, why are you reading us that? Because the word length here is the word yam in Hebrew. So the same word that is translated here as length is translated as day in Genesis 1. And so if you were to read it that way, you'd say, the day of Solomon's reign. Or if it sound better if you said the days, or the age, or the period, right? So you guys see that this word yam actually can be used in a way that means more than a 24-hour day. And so the old earth creationists, they see, it might be that this word is being used like that. Now, we'll come back to that argument later, but that's one argument. One argument is scientific consensus. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that. Scientific consensus is that the world is gazillions of years old, and so it must be. Ancient Christian writings. So there actually are ancient Christians who weren't sure what to do with the word day. Two that I'll mention are Origen, and you may not know who that is. He was an okay guy, not a great guy, but an okay guy. And Augustine, he was probably the greatest theologian the world has ever known. All right, so he's a pretty good guy. And both of them, when writing about Genesis 1, said things like, "I don't know what to do with these days." It's just strange. And they were both saying, "I don't know if I need to read this allegorically or metaphorically. I don't know what to do with this. I'm not sure if these are literal days or not." Now, neither of them were saying they didn't think God created the world. Neither of them were saying, "I'm totally opposed to a 6-day, 24-hour creation," but both of them were saying, "I don't know what to do with this word." Okay? But there are problems with this view. First problem I have, I'm kind of giving away my perspective, I think, but did death exist before sin? You see, if those days are long periods of time during which the evolutionary process played out, that would require during those days for there to be death and rebirth, right? Because that's how the process works. But Romans tells us that the whole reason there's death in this world is why? Because sin entered the world. So is it possible that there could be death in the world before there was sin in the world, and there couldn't be sin in the world before there were humans in the world, specifically Adam and Eve? So how do we have death before sin? Second question is, were there hominins? So that's like the pre-Homo sapien version of humans, okay? Google it, you'll figure it out. Were there hominins before Adam and Eve? So were there somewhere between monkey and me, there's these stages of evolution. Now what's fascinating to me is that we have like animals today that came before the hominins, and we have us who allegedly came after the hominins, but we don't have any of them, right? But if the earth is old, were there hominins before Adam and Eve? And at what point did those creatures actually have a will and moral capacity, the ability to interact with? Did you see the problem here? If I'm the last, if I'm the last missing link before Homo sapien, so I'm walking upright, I'm hunched over a little bit, I got a big funky jaw, but I can grunt and communicate that way, and I've got a lot of human tendencies. Do I now have the ability to sin? And did they all live without sin? Will they be in heaven? Did you ever think about that? So there's so many questions about how would that have worked before Adam and Eve, which really leads into the third question is, at what point does the Genesis and the Old Testament shift from poetry to narrative? So if Genesis 1 is just poetry, not to be taken literally, and that's why we can say it's 24 hours, it's not 24-hour days, it's just long days, ages, whatever we want to call them. At what point does that shift into actual narrative, actual history? Is it Genesis 2? Right? Where God makes Eve out of the rib of Adam? Oh, that sounds kind of poetry too. Let's move on. Genesis 3, where a snake talks? Well, let's move on to the next one. But the problem with this is every time we run up against something in the Bible that feels like that doesn't seem real, it's poetry. But now we've eliminated the existence of Adam and Eve. Genesis 4, Cain and Abel, that's where the real story starts. What? And then Cain marries his sister? Well, I'm not comfortable with that. Let's move on. Let's just jump a couple chapters to chapter 7, where there's a flood that wipes out. Do you see this? Where do we say, okay, now I believe that it's true and it's not poetry anymore? And so I think you got to be really careful with Genesis 1. Say, you know what? Maybe Genesis 1 is where it starts. Maybe God just really did create the world in 6 24-hour days. And I think that's actually the best argument for a young earth, is that that's what the Bible teaches. You know, God created the heavens and the earth. Goes on through. Let me show you a couple verses real quick. Exodus 20, verse 11. This is Moses giving the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel. And he's introducing them to Yahweh God, right? And this is how Moses, who's been on the mountain talking with God. So maybe more than any other human in history, Moses knows who God is and what God has done. Right? The Jewish tradition is that when Moses was up on the mountain, God actually dictated the 5 books of the law to Moses letter by letter. And how does Moses introduce God? He said, "For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them in 6 days. And then he rested on the 7th. Now, he's going to use this pattern to teach them what? To work 6 days and rest on the 7th. And nobody raises their hand at Moses, so you're saying we should work just 6 really long periods of time and then rest for a really long period of time. Now, they understood that what he means is 6 days. What about Jesus? What did Jesus think? I think Jesus was a young earth creationist. Now, I know the question he's answering here is not about creation, right? The question he's answering here is about marriage and divorce and all that kind of stuff. But what he says is, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And this is what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I believe the Genesis account. Because do you know where this statement is from? Genesis 1. And what Jesus is saying is, I look to Genesis 1 as being true and authoritative. Okay, I think there's more arguments for a young earth. I think this phrase, the evening and the morning, really helps us sort the day question. Right? So I know some of you are like, wait, does David believe in old earth because he did that whole Yom thing? And yeah, but I think actually this helps us. Remember what I said, that we use the Bible to interpret the Bible? When Genesis 1 talks about each of those days, it says the evening and the morning were the first day. It's really, really hard to interpret that as the evening and the morning were lots of days. The evening and the morning were a really long period of time. It really feels like he's saying the evening and the morning were day 1. The evening and the morning were day 2. And then finally, I think that if you look at Genesis chapter 1, it's actually pretty accurate scientifically. So things like the sky is made of water. Now could ancient people, 7,000, 8,000 years ago when Moses wrote this, did they understand what the sky was made of? We do now. But Moses wrote that the sky is made of water, the firmament. The waters were separated to the waters above and the waters below. Okay? He talks about all the animals being created according to their kind. So we still organize animals according to their kind. What is it? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species? Did I get it? Some of you guys are all looking like, what are you talking about? Is there a teacher in the room? Okay, I think I got it. So this is how we organize all animals, is into these categories. And Genesis 1 tells us that all the animals are created according to their kind. Genesis 1 tells us that the sun, moon, and stars mark time. That you can actually use the sun, moon, and stars to mark time. Imagine that. And we still use them today for all of that. Let me, I'm trying to think where to talk about this. This seems like a good place. All right, so I am a young earth creationist. I believe that God created the earth in 6 literal days. I would not burn at the stake for that, all right? Because I don't think it's a gospel issue. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. You know, we can still like each other as long as you root for the Detroit Lions. But, let me show you something that might be helpful for you, okay? Because I know there are people who struggle with this. In fact, I talk with people in our church all the time who wrestle with this. Like, can I be a Christian if I don't believe in 6 literal days? I'm like, yeah, you actually can. I want you to think this through. So go back to Neil deGrasse Tyson and in his model for how things started, because it's really how it is. So he starts with a big bang and a flash of light, and then there's this heating and cooling that takes place in nanoseconds until eventually you're left with just these big, massive kind of just boulders floating through the sky, crashing into each other. And the earth is one of these rocks, and then eventually the water mixes with the rock, and it cools the rock, and everything starts to happen. And then if you've been through school where they taught you how the evolutionary process allegedly worked, you know that the first living creatures were in the sea, right? Until they moved out on the land. I had a long conversation with ChatGPT about how that's possible. I won because I turned it off. No, but eventually they moved out of the sea and into the land. Now, how does Genesis 1 progress? It begins with God simply saying, now, like a big bang, right? And then what is the first thing God creates? Let there be light, right? So this is actually following Neil deGrasse Tyson's projection, right? And then what does it tell us? Then it tells us that the Spirit of God moved over the face of the deep, and the earth was what? Formless and void, chaos. You see this? And then what's the first thing that happens? We separate the waters. Okay? Just like the water and the rocks, cooling. And then the first living creatures are created where? In the ocean. They're sea creatures. And then after those are created, what are the next? The animals. So I don't think this is how it happened. I think God was just like 6 days, like, let this happen, let this happen, let this happen, let this happen. I'll show you why I believe that in just a second. But if God did use long periods of time, and God did use the evolutionary process to make that happen, and if he wanted Moses to write about how that happened, just imagine him sitting Moses up on Mount Sinai and saying, Moses, watch this. This is how it happened. If he watched what Neil Tyson deGrasse describes, he might write about that just like he wrote Genesis chapter 1. You see that? So if you have friends and they're like, man, I would go to church with you, but this creation thing is a hurdle I can't get over. And there are people like that. Okay? I worked with a young lady not too long ago. This was the big hurdle for her. I walked her through this, and she got saved. Okay? You can talk up to people and say, hey, you know what? I believe that God created the world, but let me show you this. Because what you believe about how the world began is kind of similar to how I believe it began. I just think God was behind it. Okay? So that's just extra. I don't have any slides for that because I wasn't going to talk about it. All right, here we go. The only problem with the 6-day creation is that it runs counter to modern sensibilities, right? That's it. There really is no other problem with it. It seems like what the whole Bible teaches, it makes sense, but it doesn't run with our modern sensibilities. But do you know what else doesn't go along with our modern sensibilities? A global flood, a man being swallowed by a great fish, and fire coming down from heaven to destroy wicked cities. So we know that's Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So, Jesus, in the New Testament, quoted the Old Testament a lot, right? I find it fascinating that most of the stories that Jesus quoted in the New Testament are the stories that are the hardest for us to believe. Stories like a global flood, Jonah being swallowed by a great fish, and fire coming down to consume cities. So let me show you really quick. We're going to hustle through this. What Jesus had to say. Oh, here we go again. I could not read this if I tried. All right. So in Matthew 24, verse 37, it says, as the days of Noah were coming, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. So Jesus, when he talks about Noah, he talks about it as a settled historical fact, right? This absolutely happened. Jesus had no question about that. Let me go over here to Matthew. By the way, these are all from Matthew, which is interesting because Matthew is primarily written to a Jewish audience, And so what Matthew is doing, he's saying, all these stories that you know from the Old Testament that Jesus also knew, he's the Messiah, so he's able to interpret these for us. All right, so this is Matthew chapter 12, verse 39. He answered them, an evil and adulterous generation demands a sign, but no sign will be given to it except what? Except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, and then he goes on from there. So again, Jesus is saying, I believe these stories are 100% true. One more, this is Matthew chapter 10, verse 19. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. We're going to come back to some of these as we go. But here's what Jesus is saying. There's a lot of things in the Bible that go against modern sensibilities, right? A lot of things that go against modern sensibilities, like all of these things, like a 6-day literal creation. There's one more thing that goes against our sensibilities, isn't there? Resurrection of the dead. And I would say this, guys. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He was literally in the ground dead, and 3 days later, he was alive. I believe that happened. And if I believe that happened, it's not so much to believe that the God who did that could create everything in 6 days. And really, that's why I land there. All right, we spent a lot of time here, way more than I thought I would. So I'm going to have to move faster now. But don't worry. I didn't plan to spend a lot of time on Cain. But let's get to Cain. Who did Cain marry, and who wanted to kill him? Somebody asked me this a few weeks ago when we went through the Cain story. They came up to me after the service and said, hey, just a question. Cain was afraid that people were going to kill him. You remember this part of the story? That God's like, Cain, you messed up, you're in trouble. And Cain's like, you can't send me away. People are going to kill me. Then you're like, wait a minute. He just killed his brother, and only his parents are left. So, maybe he's just being like the overly dramatic teenager there. My parents are going to kill me. I actually think he was afraid, though. But I'm going to tell you that the answer to the who did he marry question is probably the same answer to who's going to kill him. And I talked a lot about it in 2 sermons back a few years ago. The first sermon is all about the line of Cain. The second sermon is all about the line of Seth. They're interesting. You might enjoy them. But now let's answer the question, who did Cain marry? Well, there's only a couple options. Did he marry his sister? Did he marry his niece? Did he marry his great niece 3 times removed? Which would be like Abel's daughter's daughter. Right? Is that possible? Yeah. I think that's the answer. It's one of those. I don't know which one, but it's one of those. Here's why I say that. Remember, and we'll see this as we go, early on in the history of the world, people lived for a really long time, like almost 1,000 years. And during that time, they had lots of kids. And so while they're having all of these kids, who are they going to marry? Well, they're going to marry each other's kids. That's kind of what they have to do. Now, I know we're all like, ooh, that's yucky. That's gross. It is a little bit, but understand why. So DNA is problematic for us if we marry someone who shares our DNA. Because our DNA is really, really flawed. All of us have lots of problems in our DNA. And if I marry someone that has the same flaws as me in their DNA, then the results can be really bad. And so we're like, yeah, you shouldn't marry your sister. You shouldn't marry your cousin. You stay away from people who share your DNA because otherwise you're going to have really unhealthy DNA. But Adam and Eve had perfect DNA, right? There was nothing wrong with their DNA. Now, after them, Cain and Abel, their DNA was slightly flawed, but not a lot. I mean, obviously their DNA was good. They lived almost 1,000 years. And so when they're marrying brothers and sisters, there's not nearly the risk here of DNA issues because they have great DNA. And it really only takes about 2 or 3 generations until you have enough people spread out all over from different places that you're no longer having to marry cousins, nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters. Okay? So I think that's the answer. It's kind of a weird answer, but I think that's the answer. All right? So let's move on to the reason you're all here tonight, to talk about the Nephilim. Okay? Some people call them the Nephilim. You can call them either. That's okay. I know you're looking at this guy and saying, is that one of them? I thought that was Hercules. Well, it is Hercules. And we'll talk about why Hercules matters in this conversation in a minute. But there's really 3 questions for us here. Okay? Here's the 3. Yes, there you go. You see the sermon on this. All right, 3 questions here. Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? And who are the Nephilim? And again, I have a typo there, so my bad. All right, let's read the story. Genesis 6, when mankind began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, that's our first question, who are these guys? Who are the sons of God? Saw that the daughters of man were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. Now, by the way, that phrase right there is meaningful, particularly when we get to the flood. Because what it shows us is that whatever's going on here is evil. You have whoever these men are just taking their women for themselves. Now, I'll just point this out because the Bible is cool like this. Notice the words here. They saw and they took. You guys, have we heard that language before in Genesis? Like Genesis 3, when Eve saw and she took. And so when we see these words together, it's like oh, okay, I get it. So what's happening here is bad. Whatever's happening, it's bad. So sons of men, daughters of women, whatever they're doing is bad. And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. We'll come back to that phrase. It matters. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind. All right, so again, we don't know who these people are, but whatever's going on is they're getting together, who bore children to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men. All right, so some translations say they were the men of renown. Translators kind of got away from that language because renown sounds famous and good. That's not at all what the original language would mean. It just means that everybody knew who they are because they were pretty bad. Okay? Now, here's option 1 for us, answering those questions. Option 1 is that the sons of God were from the line of Seth, and the daughters of men were from the line of Cain. No, I got that revert. Yeah, okay. Yes, that's right. Okay. Sons of God, daughters of men. Seth, Cain. So you understand Cain, we know Cain's story. He kills Abel, right? He goes off, has to build his own city, has all these people that are his descendants living without God. Their story's all in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 5, we meet the line of Seth. Right? Seth is the next son that Adam and Eve have, and he is the son of the promise. Okay? And in fact, it's through Seth's line that Jesus is eventually going to come in fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. So Seth's line is the righteous line. Out of Seth's line comes Enoch, who walked with God, and then he was no more. Out of Seth's line comes Noah, who God rescues from the flood. So the idea here is that the sons of God, who were the line of Seth, were marrying the daughters of Cain. And so you were getting this intermingling of righteousness and unrighteousness. And anytime that happens in the Bible, it goes badly, right? This is one of Israel's biggest problems throughout the Old Testament, is that they're going out and marrying people from other lands. And when you marry somebody from another nation, you bring their gods into the equation. You forget about your own God. And maybe that's what's happening here. There's a couple good arguments for this idea. One is that Genesis 4 is the line of Cain, Genesis 5 is the line of Seth, and this is Genesis 6. So like Genesis 4 and 5 are setting this up. That seems to make sense. Secondly, God's punishment in Genesis 6, that's the flood, is directed towards humans, not angels. And some of you are like, wait, when do we start talking about angels? Right now, because this is option 2. There it is. Okay. This is the one that makes people say, what? Option 2 is that the sons of man were angels. And the daughters of man, or the sons of God, again, these typos are driving. So this is how you know I didn't just cut and paste this stuff, right? The daughters of men were human. So angels and humans having babies. That's option number 2. And you're like, wait, whoa. Did you know that almost every ancient culture has stories about gods and humans having children together? Like the story of Hercules, right? Zeus is his father, and his mother is, does anyone know who his mother is? I got to go back to here to see my notes. Let's go, there he is, and they're not there. so I don't remember who his mother was. All right. But Zeus marries, that's the Greek story. But every ancient culture has these stories. And so some people say, well, this is just Genesis' effort to have the same story as all the ancient things. Or, just stay with me on this. What if there was this global catastrophe and everybody on earth died except for one family? And in that family, let's say there were 3 sons. And those 3 sons then kind of spread out in different directions, and all people on earth were ultimately descendants of those 3 sons. Let's just say that happened. Now, don't you think that family, while they were on a boat for a year, being saved from the global catastrophe, would have some conversations about what had just happened in the world they used to live in? And that maybe they might tell those stories to their kids. Like, hey kids, before the flood, there were these really bad dudes called the Nephilim. And they were the sons of angels, heavenly deities, and people. And wouldn't it be possible that those stories over time would get changed and tweaked a little as people got further and further from God and further from the truth? And these stories might take on something like gods and people having babies. So maybe, just maybe, and we'll talk about this theory again in a little bit, maybe, just maybe, the reason all cultures have this story is because at one time there were heavenly beings that came down to earth and had relationships with women. Well, it's like, Dave, this is really far-fetched. So let's dig into it, shall we? All right, here we go. Job, chapter 1, verse 6. It says, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. Who are the sons of God in this verse? They are angels. Okay? So the reason I'm laying this down is because there's a Greek or a Hebrew phrase for sons of God that is used here, and it's the same one that is used in Genesis. There are other places in the Old Testament where sons of God is translated into English, but the Hebrew is not the same. So this is the one that's the same, and here in this phrase, it's actually talking about angels. Let's go to the New Testament. This is Jude 6. Jude only has 1 chapter, so we don't do chapters and verse. We just say Jude verse 6. Jude says this, He, that's God, has kept with eternal chains and darkness for the judgment of the great day the angels who did not keep their own position, but deserted their proper dwelling. So God is keeping, right now, God is keeping angels in judgment. Why? Because they didn't stay where they were supposed to stay. They went somewhere they weren't supposed to go. And in the same way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them committed sexual immorality and practiced perversions. You guys read the next phrase? Just as the angels did. What do you do with this? So what Jude is saying is that you had angels who were sexually immoral. These angels who left the place they were supposed to be, and they were sexually immoral, and serve an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. But Jude's not the only person that talks about this. Somebody else does too. Because we don't know much about Jude, right? We're like, Jude, who's that? Is he even in the Bible? He was actually probably Jesus' brother, one of Jesus' brothers, but we don't know that for sure. Well, how about this guy? You know Peter, right? We all know Peter. Peter writes about this, 2 Peter. For if God didn't spare the angels who sinned, who are these angels who sinned? He's not quite as specific as Jude, but he's hinting at something here. But threw them down into Tartarus, it's the only place in the Bible that word appears, and delivered them to be kept in chains of darkness until judgment. So again, Peter's saying there are these angels who did something they weren't supposed to do, and they're now being kept in chains until judgment. Now, by the way, Tartarus is not used in the Bible other than here, but it's used a lot in ancient Greek. And it always refers to a place of judgment. And one of the great stories is that Zeus, we've already met him once tonight, Zeus actually took the Titans, that would be Thanos, and threw them into Tartarus and bound them there forever. So Tartarus is this place of ultimate judgment. So as Peter's writing, he's just using the common language of his day and saying this place of ultimate judgment, these angels are bound up. Now guess what? We read about this place somewhere else. It's in Revelation chapter 9. The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth. That's probably an angel going down. The key to the shaft of the abyss was given to him. He opened the shaft of the abyss, and smoke came up out of the shaft like smoke from a great furnace, so that the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the shaft. Then locusts, and if you read the rest of the passage, you see that these are probably demons, fallen angels. So here stay with me. Revelation tells us that there is this place called an abyss, where right now, angels are being kept. And in the last times, in the end of all things, for a very brief period of time, they are going to be released to wreak havoc on the earth before they face final judgment and are thrown into the lake of fire. Peter tells us that there are angels who sinned who are being kept in the abyss. Jude tells us that there are angels who did something they weren't supposed to do and that it was sexually perverse because they left the place they were supposed to leave and they came here and did this thing. They are being kept in that place. So do you see all of this works together? Now, let's just for a second step outside the Bible, okay? I'm going to take you to a book called First Enoch. This is not in our Bibles, but it's a very ancient Hebrew text. So it's not considered inspired scripture, but it's something that we can look at historically to see what has been believed for a very long time. And in fact, Jude references Enoch in his writing. It says, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven," do you hear the language is similar here to Genesis 6? "Saw and lusted after them and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and beget us children." Skip over to the next chapter in 1 Enoch, and it says, "And they became pregnant," that's the women, "and they bare great giants, the Nephilim, whose height was 3,000 ells." I have no idea what an ell is, okay, but they're really tall. "Who consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind." So do you see what this is a picture of? It's this idea that the Nephilim, the offspring of angels and humans, are destroying humanity. So much so that Enoch says that the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Now, by the way, there are other ancient texts that have these same kinds of writing in them. In fact, when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls about 80 years ago, we found many that are also really ancient texts that have the same idea. So this is really a part of the Hebrew tradition, that this is a reality, that this is what happened. If this is true, does this put a new light on why God might have sent a flood? Do you see what Enoch says? He says, "And when men could no longer sustain them." So they basically enslaved humans, and they're taking everything that humans have built up to that time. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. So humans created in the image of God are being destroyed by the sins of the angels. Does that maybe give us an idea as to why God might say something like, "I've got to wipe this out. I've got to clean this up"? I would suggest that Genesis 6 reminds us that God's judgment is always mixed with grace and mercy. And when we talk about the flood, it's hard to think about the flood as being gracious or merciful. But if indeed this was God's way of resetting things, and what we saw in the New Testament, right, in Jude and Peter, what we see is that all those angels that did this, they're put into the abyss. So never again can this happen. God's showing grace and mercy. Now, you guys remember, back when we were reading this, I said, remember that phrase, right? The Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. Now, there's some arguments about what this means. I think most people agree that what God is saying is, I'm going to destroy the earth in 120 years. This is amazing mercy and grace. Because for those 120 years, there's this guy named Noah, and he's building an ark. And he's doing what? He's preaching. The whole time Noah's building the ark, he's preaching. He's saying to people, hey, God's going to destroy the world. Repent and turn to him. Repent and turn to him. Repent and turn to him. Over and over. Because God is gracious and merciful. We're not going to have enough time tonight to dive into this, but it's in the sermon series I've mentioned a couple times. That the ark is a picture of Jesus. Right? The ark is a picture of Jesus because it's in the ark that you have salvation. Noah wasn't saved because he built the ark. Noah wasn't even saved because he preached. Noah was saved because when the rain came, he got in the ark. Only the ark could save him. We are not saved because of all the good works that we do. We are not saved just because we preach. We are saved because we are in Christ, because only Jesus can save us. And that ark was big enough to save anyone. Anyone who had gotten on the ark would have been saved, just like anyone who believes in Jesus will be saved. But anyone who did not get on the ark was not saved, just like anyone who does not believe in Jesus will not be saved. So, if you don't believe in Jesus, believe in Jesus, all right? Let's get to the flood. Was there a real global flood, and why? We talked about why kind of already. Things were really bad. If you want to look at the sermon on that, you can watch it right there. Let me give you a book right up front here, okay? If you don't like to read, don't get this book, okay? If you don't like to study, don't get this book. If you don't like either science or history or research of any kind, don't get this book. But if you dig that stuff, get this book, okay? This is an old book. It's more than 50 years old. It's one of the really first really good books that took science and said, look, there is so much scientific evidence that there was this massive global flood. So it's a really good book, but like I said, I don't know, it's probably like 800 pages. It's like this thick, and it's small print. But if you like that stuff, get the book. All right. Jesus said, we already hit this verse once. Jesus said, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. People went on eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. So you see, Jesus is doing what I just did. Say the flood is a picture of judgment, right? And in the same way, he's also saying, I believe the flood happened. So we could stop right here and be done, in my opinion. Because we believe whatever Jesus believed. If Jesus says it, we believe it. Jesus says there was a flood. I'm good with that, but we'll keep going, all right? How big was the flood? Some people say, well, it was probably a big flood, but it wasn't like the whole earth, right? Like everything covered in water? Is that really possible? Well, that's what Genesis says. This is God talking. 7 days from now, I will make it rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And I will wipe off from the face of the earth every living thing I have made. And Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 days when the flood came and water covered the earth. So that not like covered the plains of Shinar, but it covered the earth. Another verse later on. Then the waters surged even higher on the earth, and all the high mountains under the whole sky were covered. The mountains were covered as the waters surged above them more than 20 feet. So essentially what it's saying is the highest mountains were covered by more than 20 feet of water. And people think this number 20 feet, it's, in other translations, is 15 cubits. Most people think the reason that is the number given is because the ark was actually 40 feet tall. And so 20 feet of it would have been below the water, and they never hit a mountain. And since they never hit a mountain, Noah said, well, it must have been at least 20 feet. So that's probably the best guess. Now, I will say this. I think probably at the time of the flood, the mountains were not as high as they are today. Because I would argue that the flood was this catastrophic event, unlike anything the world has ever known, and much of the seismic activity that creates mountains happened at the time of the flood. And so to say that they covered all the mountains doesn't necessarily mean that Everest was as tall as it is today, but they covered them. All right, so let's keep going here in Genesis. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the sources of the watery depths burst open, the floodgates of the sky were opened, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I want you to see this because this helps us to get a perspective of how the Bible all works together. Okay? So the description of the flood, you have water coming from multiple directions. Right? First of all, it says that the watery depths burst open. So this is water that's coming from beneath. Now, we don't know exactly how to account for this because the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what it means. We do know back in Genesis chapter 2 that it says at the beginning of creation it never rained, but water came up from the ground to water everything. So there was apparently these massive reservoirs of water beneath the ground. But at the flood, those burst up, which would have caused earthquakes, right? Seismic activity, continents shifting. All of that would have been caused by massive water coming up. But also the floodgates of the sky were opened. People wrestle with what this means. There's a lot of ideas. One of the most common, in the book I showed you, discusses this, is this idea that before the flood, the earth was kind of surrounded by water. Like a membrane of water surrounded the earth. Like our atmosphere was actually water, which would have created kind of like a greenhouse. So everything on earth would have been tropical, right? There would have been no ice, how great does that sound today? Right? Everything would have been primed for growth. Now this makes sense because we know that when Adam and Eve sinned, one of the things that God said is now it's going to be hard to work, which means that before they sinned, it was not hard to work. The way the earth was originally created, everything was just going to grow perfectly and amazingly. Additionally, in a world like that, people would have been able to live a much longer time because the vegetation would have been awesome, right? You wouldn't have been exposed to the elements. It would have been a great place to live. And if indeed that's the case, so if there was before the flood this canopy of water surrounding the world, you would expect for people to live a long time. Then, when the canopy of water collapses, you would have a flood, and then you would say, well, maybe people won't last as long now. All right, so with that in mind, let me show you some things, okay? This is Genesis 9. Now, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. We know he lived 600 years before the flood, so he lived how many years? 950 years. That's right in the average. If you read in Genesis 5, the guy who lived the longest is this guy named Methuselah, who lived for 969 years. But most of his relatives lived similar amounts of time. Noah's dad, Lamech, only lived 777 years, probably because God graciously took him the year before the flood. Right? So he didn't die in the flood. Enoch also lived a very short time, just a little over 300 years, because he was this amazing guy who had a relationship with God. It just says he walked with God and then he was no more. He didn't die. God just took him up to heaven. By the way, I'll just mention this for funsies. Some people think that Enoch is a symbol of the rapture, because the flood is a symbol of God's judgment. The ark is a symbol of Jesus. Enoch being taken up to heaven right before the flood is a picture of the church being raptured up to heaven right before the final judgment. So that's just for funsies. Do what you want with it. Back to Genesis 9. Shem, this is Noah's son, lived 100 years and fathered Arpachshad. 2 years after the flood, after he fathered Arpachshad, Shem lived 500 years and fathered other sons and daughters. All right? So Shem lived 100 years and then fathered him, so 600 years. Okay. Few generations later, this guy named Peleg. Peleg lived 30 years and fathered Reu. And after he fathered Reu, Peleg lived 209. Do you see what's happening here? Each generation is living a lot less, until a few generations later, we get to this guy Nahor, who lived 29 years and fathered Terah. And after he fathered Terah, he lived 119 years, so 148. He's 148 when he dies. His great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Noah lived 900 years. He lives less than 200. What's happening here? Why are people living less and less? It's because our environment no longer supports life the way it once did. The canopy is gone. It collapsed in the flood, and now you have all of these people who are living much less time. By the way, just so you know, Terah is Abraham's father. Okay, so that gets us to Abraham at that point. Abraham lived, I don't remember exactly, a little over 100 years. Why am I talking about all these numbers? Some of you are like, absolutely, like, please move on from this. The reason I want you to see this is because the account of the flood tells us water from below, water from above. The only way you could possibly have enough water to flood the entire earth so that it's 20 feet over the mountaintops is if you had water that just came out of nowhere, right? Rain for 40 days it's going to cause a flood. It's not going to cause a flood like that. And so now we understand that this water that came from below caused cataclysmic shifts in the earth. I mean, just try to imagine water gushing up, running all around the place, this water canopy collapsing, water coming from all directions would have almost instantaneously destroyed all life and very quickly would have covered the whole earth. And what we see happen next on earth supports the theory that this happened, because now people are living for less and less. Some people are like, okay, David, great, but, I mean, is it really legitimate to believe in this? Like what about historical and geological records? Can we believe in a flood if we look at science and history? Well, let's start with history. Here we go again with the ancient myths, right? Every ancient civilization had a flood story, okay? Epic of Gilgamesh was in Mesopotamia. Manu and the Matsya Avatar, India. The Hopi tribe, they're not the only ones. There are several Native American tribes that had flood narratives. The flood of Bergelmir, I like that one. That's the Norse, the Vikings. The Tanzanian flood tradition, and again, there are several African flood traditions. I just picked one, okay? Now, I want you to see what I did here, because these aren't the only ones, but I tried to get a representation of the whole earth. Everywhere you go in the world, the ancient people had this flood story. And they're not all exact, but there are some things that are in common. In almost all of them, the whole world is destroyed by a flood. And in almost all of them, only one family survives. And in almost all of them, the only reason that family survives is because some deity appeared to them and told them to build a boat. Where does that come from? Well, again, hypothetically, if there was a family and 3 sons and they spread out all over the earth and they told all their kids and their kids told their kids, doesn't it make sense that wherever Ham, Shem, and Japheth's kids went, they would have told the story to their kids, who would have told the story to their kids, and the story would have changed over time? But it all started somewhere. And you can't have a story that is told all over the world by people who didn't know each other, didn't have the internet, right? So they weren't connected to each other, but they're all telling the same story to their kids. Why? Because that story happened. So when we talk about historically, is there evidence for a flood? Yeah, everywhere you go in the world, historically, there's evidence for a flood. A great flood. A flood that destroyed the world, and one family was saved because the deity appeared to them and told them to build a boat. Okay? But what about science? Okay, again, you guys know, I've told you this, I'm not a scientist. I'm terrible at science. D+ in high school, D+ in college. I'm a terrible science person, so I'm not even going to try to explain it. There are good answers, but I don't have them. But you can look these things up. Okay, Google these. The Missoula flood, the Bonneville flood, the Ojibwe Barlow flood, the Laurentide ice sheet meltwater floods. Isn't that one a fun one to say? These are all North American floods that we don't know exactly when they happened. Scientists date them anywhere from 10,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago. And these are massive floods. Floods that covered huge areas. So like the Ojibwe Barlow flood, probably people think that's where the Great Lakes came from. So massive flood. The Bonneville flood covered most of what we think of as the Mountain West area of the United States, right? So like the Great Salt Lake is like the last remains of that one. And the submergence of Doggerland, just look that up. That's the land between mainland Europe and England. And there's a lot of people who believe that at one point that was not submerged. Like people lived there and there was a civilization there, and then something happened. And then it was submerged and it was gone. I read this article in National Geographic. Okay, so this is not a Christian publication. This is an article in National Geographic. I'll just read you the beginning. It says, on a summer day, 110 million years ago, so you guys understand the perspective this is coming from, an armored dinosaur, so that doesn't mean it was wearing armor, just it had really thick skin, likely ambled through the remains of a wildfire in what is now Alberta, Canada, gobbling up delicate green ferns peeking out from the ash. Now, just you guys know where Alberta, Canada is, right? Like you hit the Dakotas and keep going. So what we have outside today, that's Alberta like 8 months out of the year. It's not a place that has lush ferns. But 110 million years ago, it did. Somehow, shortly after, the dinosaur ended up dead in a river among the Cretaceous landscape and was swept out to sea. All right, there's no seas in Alberta. Okay? No, there's no big seas in Alberta. But this dinosaur somehow got into one. Now, scientists studying the extraordinary fossil have made a new discovery. So they've found this dinosaur that was in Alberta and got swept out to sea. They made a new discovery, a ball of plant matter undigested in its stomach. So what, right? This is so cool. What that means, that dinosaur was eating and had eaten enough to have the plants in its stomach, but it had not eaten long ago enough that those plants were digested. And then something happened that so quickly preserved this dinosaur that plant matter didn't go away. It just remained preserved, undigested, according to them, millions of years. What could have done that? Well, it would have had to be a flood to wash it out to sea. But it couldn't have just been 40 days of rain that caused the waters to rise slowly. It would have had to be this massive wall of water moving so fast and so strongly that it was instantaneously killed this thing and submerged it and put it in a place where it would be fossilized right there. Something like water coming up from below and a massive water canopy collapsing from above. So National Geographic is so close, but so far. So here's the big question. And this is actually where we started, right? When we started talking about, is there a God? And when it comes to the flood, it's the same question. The question is not, is there evidence? But the question is, how will I interpret the evidence? And like I said, I'm not going to tonight go into great detail into all of the fossil records and all of that, but there's a ton of evidence out there that you can interpret it one way or you can interpret it another way. It depends on whether you have your purple glasses on or not. It depends on what your presupposition is. And if your presupposition is that there is a God and He created the world and He gave us His Word and we can read in His Word to understand how everything happened, then it makes perfect sense to say there was this global flood because God wanted to destroy these people who were creating humanity so we could start over and have this beautiful picture of grace and mercy. And it's all recorded here in Genesis for us, and He even showed us how it happened. And that's why there's this dinosaur with plant matter in its stomach that's perfectly preserved. Or you can say, well, we don't know how this happened, but it couldn't have been God. Now, if you want to dig more into the flood, you are so lucky because you live like an hour and a half drive from the ark, right? That's not the real ark, okay? This is not the real ark, but you can go to the ark encounter. I'm gonna just say something really quick here, okay? About Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. I think that Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis do a ton of good. I think they scientifically do some really good work, and they've hashed out some really good things. They do a ton of good. I want to give one warning. They are a little too divisive for my tastes, because sometimes they go down this line of, if you don't believe in Genesis 1, you don't believe in six-day literal creation, then you don't believe the Bible, you don't believe the gospel, you don't believe Jesus. That's illogical, okay? So one of the surest signs of maturity is being able to eat the meat and spit the bones. Right? My dogs can't do that. If I give my dogs a chicken leg, they'll try to eat the whole thing because they're not humans. we're able to eat meat and spit bones. So when it comes to answers in Genesis, when it comes to Ken Ham, so much good stuff. And if you want to study the flood and all that, the Genesis stuff, man, go enjoy the Creation Museum, enjoy the Ark. Just be careful that we don't unnecessarily create divisions with our brothers who may not see it the same way we do. Because where we started is what? The main thing is the plain thing, the plain thing is the main thing. These are not plain things, these are not the main things. The main thing is the gospel, and we can have lots of different opinions on Genesis and still believe the gospel. All right? So, go here, enjoy it, lots of good stuff, lots of good information, and you can go a lot more about the flood. And with that, I am done. So, if you have questions, you can text them here, and I will see if we have any. Maybe we don't. We do. All right, just a second. All right. We have lots. You guys can just take a minute here. I'm going to try to look through these really quickly. These are good questions. All right. A lot of stuff about the book of Enoch. Now you guys are curious. Okay. All right. All right. Let's talk about the book of Enoch real quick, because there's a bunch of questions about that. So, is the book of Enoch written by the same Enoch in the Bible? No idea. No idea. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think we know. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go through the other questions. This is good. I've been told to not read the books of Enoch because of some claims Enoch has. Not sure what, because I've never read them. Should we read those books but recognize them as fiction? Great question. And the answer is yes. That's a great approach. Read them. They're interesting, but recognize that they're not inspired. Okay? It's kind of like we can read history books about the ancient Greeks. Okay? The Greeks aren't in the Bible. The ancient Greeks aren't in the Bible. But what's happening in their world is happening at the same time as some of the other things in the Bible. So, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the battle, that amazing battle where you have 300 Spartans that hold off all the hordes of Persia. Really cool story. And we know all about it from history books, and we read lots of historical sources that tell us about it. Did you know that the king of Persia is Esther's husband? Right? We'll get to that later this year when we get to Esther in the Old Testament. But remember the story of Esther? King Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, however you want to call him, he throws this big party and has this big party, and he tells his wife to come out and, put on a show, and she says no. So he's like, okay, you're not my wife anymore. Find me a new wife. And that's how Esther comes to the throne, right? So that party is actually the king gathering all of the other kings that he rules over, bringing them to Persia, throwing them a big party because, hey guys, we're going to Greece. And then there's this gap in the Esther story of several years. Why? Because the king's in Greece fighting against the Spartans and losing. And then he comes back. So, we can read the historical accounts and recognize, hey, this is happening at the same time as the Bible, and it actually gives us some really cool context as to how we understand the Bible. But it's not the Bible. And we read the books of Enoch the same way. They're written, they're ancient literature. They can, maybe shed some light on some things, but we don't necessarily believe everything we read there because not everything in them is true. All right? So, go ahead and read it, but recognize that it's not inspired. Okay. So Enoch is not a book of the Bible. It's just an ancient Hebrew book. There's several other of these kind of ancient Hebrew writings. There's one called Jubilee. There's a few others. These are different than what's sometimes called the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha are these collection of books that are in the Catholic Bible. Those occur between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So you have their books like First and Second Maccabees, Bel and the Dragon, some of those kind of things. Those are they're what we call the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. This is different because this actually is before. All right, so yeah, probably more information than any of you wanted to know. Let's see, go on here. All right, a lot of good questions here. Why, in your opinion, did God choose to include little stories in the Old Testament that are so strange and hard to understand in our modern culture, and seemingly have nothing to do with the gospel story? For example, the kids who made fun of Elisha getting mauled by bears. How many of you know that story? Yeah, it's like wait, what? That's in the Bible? Yeah, Elisha the prophet's walking around and a bunch of kids make fun of him because he's bald, and some bears come out of the woods and eat them. What's that? We sang that song. In preschool? Who's teaching kids that song? Don't make fun of bald people or a bear will eat you. All right, so this is a really good question, and I think the answer is twofold. I think one of the answers is there are some of these that I struggle with knowing why they're in the Bible. I'll just be honest. I'm like I don't know why this has to be in there. But some of them I think are in there just to sometimes develop bigger themes and help us see things a little bit differently. For example, like the story of Lot. We talked about Lot at the Chili Bowl. And why is that even in there? Like, how does the story of Lot advance the story at all? It doesn't. Now, it gives us a nice foil to compare to Abraham, makes Abraham look a little bit better. But at the end of the day, it seems like the story of Lot is in there just so we know where the Amalekites came from and what was the other tribe? I want to say it's not Moabites. That's what I want to say. Maybe it is the Moabites. And that's why it's in there. So you got this whole long story, and then you get to the very end, it's like, oh, that's why it's there. Sometimes that's what it is, to give us some context. But at the end of the day, there are some stories that's just like, I don't know. My own rule of thumb is, when I come to those kinds of stories, what I start looking for is, what do I learn about God's character in this story? Right? What does God value? So like the story of Elisha and the bears, it's like, okay, God values his prophet. God takes care of his prophet. And so that teaches me something about God, and it gives me confidence in him. All right, why doesn't God explicitly explain if the characters in a story are sinning instead of just stating the facts and letting us figure out what's right and wrong? For example, Abraham taking other wives. I think I don't want to speak for God and what his intentions are, but I think there's something to be said for him wanting us to pursue him and to pursue his word. He doesn't want to just, if he just wanted to say, hey, look, here's 600 laws that you can follow. Just do these 600 things and don't worry about it. But we love stories. And so I think he communicates to us through stories. And I think he wants us to take the time and make the effort to dig into those, to figure them out, because it's in that process that we get to know him. It's kind of like when you first meet somebody, and you just start trading stories, right? And as you trade stories, you begin to learn about that person and learn about that person and learn about. And I think that's one of the reasons that God does that, rather than just laying it all out for us and saying, "Here you go." There's that relational aspect. There's probably lots of other reasons. That's a really good question, though. How do we know which of God's Old Testament laws are irrelevant to us? For example, children who dishonor their parents should be stoned to death. Well, I think that's still relevant. At one point, we had 8 kids. That's not true. So I would say this. In one sense, you could make the point that all of the law is irrelevant because Jesus fulfilled it all. And so the only law that matters is his law. And his law is love God, love your neighbor, love one another. So we could say that. And then you could go back into the Old Testament and say, which of these laws are loving God, loving your neighbor, loving one another? And then you can say, okay, I should probably do those. That would be a really easy starting point. We could go into more depth there and talk about how in the law of Moses, there are several different kinds of laws. Some of the laws are like national laws designed just for that nation at that time. Some of the laws are purity laws, which were designed for how they worshiped God in the tabernacle and the temple at that time. So because we don't have a tabernacle and a temple anymore, and because we don't need a mediator anymore, because Jesus changed all that, we don't have to worry about any of those laws. Because we're not national Israel, we don't have to worry about any of those laws. If you go online and just do a little bit of research on those questions, like say, I want to learn more about national laws of Israel, I want to learn more about the purity laws, you can really learn a lot. If you really want to get into it, send me an email. I'll send you lots of resources on that. But that's kind of a really quick overview on how we take the Old Testament, make it relative to the New Testament. I would say this, though. The Ten Commandments are just a great law code that works. Like I would make an argument that every society should be built on the Ten Commandments because they work. All right, we're getting more questions in. I'm taking too long. Dinosaurs. Why weren't dinosaurs on the ark if they lived during and then died in the flood? So a couple thoughts on that. It never says in the Bible how old the animals that went on the ark were. Like you could have a baby boy dinosaur and a baby girl dinosaur. They would have taken up a lot less space. And then also understand that like species evolve. You don't cross over into other species. So like dogs don't become cats, but dogs become other kinds of dogs. So you could have easily had like 2 dogs, and then over time that grew into lots of other kinds of dogs, 2 cats, that kind of thing. So there was plenty of room on the ark for all of those. I think dinosaurs probably were on the ark. There is a passage in Job, I can't give it to you off the top of my head, that describes an animal that Job saw. Job lived after the flood. That sounds a lot like he's describing a dinosaur. So I would argue there were probably dinosaurs on the flood, but a lot of them did die in the flood. The best argument for why the dinosaurs died quickly after the flood was because dinosaurs needed a tropical environment. And after the flood, most of the earth was not a tropical environment, and so it was no longer a good place for them to live. Probably there's a lot of animals that didn't survive long after the flood. Probably shortly after the flood, the earth was plunged into an ice age because the climate had changed so much, but I digress. How and when do I introduce these ideas of faith with my children so that their faith is more clear and less cloudy? Now. I think now is a good time to do it. You don't have to go into great detail, but I think it's important to tell your kids Bible stories as if they're true. Do I have time to get on a soapbox just for a second? My kids watched VeggieTales, okay? They watched VeggieTales. I'm not that guy. I always struggled with VeggieTales because my concern was that VeggieTales turned Bible stories into cartoon stories. And when kids watch VeggieTales, it's very easy for them to say, well, that's VeggieTales and that's PB&J Otter, and they're the same thing. So I think it's really important that show your kids VeggieTales or Bible Man or whatever, that's fine, right? That's fine. But make sure you talk about it and say, hey, these are real stories. These are actual people. They lived. And when you tell them the stories as if they're actual real people, so that your kids don't grow up with the idea that, Batman and Noah, same idea, right? They have to just understand that they're true stories. Okay. All right. You guys need to stop asking questions. If you could just share a little bit about Noah being the new Adam. Let me come back to that if I have time. Okay, have you heard about the discovery last year of a massive ocean deep in the Earth's mantle, 700 kilometers below the Earth's surface, 3 times the volume of the oceans we know today? No, I had not, but that sounds awesome. So if you know, you can shoot me a link about it. I'd like to read about it. Thoughts on views of Big Bang Theory where God was the banger? Again, I think that's old Earth creationism. And, what I outlined with Neil deGrasse Tyson's idea, I think, shows that, the Big Bang and then what follows actually follows the same pattern as creation. But, I think God's capable of creating in 6 days, so I think he probably did. All right, yeah. Is there ever a circumstance where you would take typical understanding of science to interpret the Bible? For example, there was a time when most people understood the earth to be flat and cited evidence from Scripture. If so, what guidelines would you use in evaluation? Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the answer is I wouldn't take science to interpret the Bible, but I would allow my understanding of the world around me to shape what kind of literature the Bible is. Right? I understand that some things in the Bible are poetry. And I understand that because I understand how poetry works and how the world is. So in Psalm 19, fantastic passage, all about the Bible and how great the Bible is. And there's this phrase in there about the sun running across the sky like a bridegroom to his tent. Beautiful picture, right? Bridegroom's excited about the wedding. He's running, right, to get to the wedding. Awesome. I get that the sun does not run across the sky, right? I don't need a scientist to say, well, David, science contradicts this passage. Like, no, I get it. This is a poem, and I know the sun doesn't run across the sky, but I know that because it's a poem. So I think if you reasonably read the Bible as it's written, most of these places iron themselves out. I understand in Revelation when it talks about the four corners of the earth, that the earth doesn't have four corners, but that's an expression that we often use to describe the all-encompassing thing, right? So I just think it's important to say, allow your understanding of the world to help you read the Bible, but don't change your view on something just because it makes you uncomfortable, right? The science makes me uncomfortable, so I'm going to believe something else. Then you have to really question what your motives are. All right. Dun, 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 dun. I'm going to come back to that one. It's a good one. All right. We often talk about God knowing all things. And I often wonder, didn't God know the sons of God will lust after the daughters of man, so why create them in the first place, only to destroy the world? I get with Adam and Eve, he wanted them to choose to love him, but I get confused regarding why an all-knowing God allows sin when it could have been avoided if it wasn't even created in the first place. I love God, this just confuses me. Yeah, me too. All right. When we talk about these really hard questions about who God is and what he does, we have to remember our starting point, okay? Our starting point is that he is God and we are not. So, there are always going to be things about God that I don't understand because I'm not him. Now, if you struggle with that, think about a husband and wife relationship, right? There are things I don't understand about my wife, and I probably never will because I'm not her. And there are things that she doesn't understand about me because she's not me. If I understood everything about her, I would be her. And then she'd just be married to herself, and that would be, no fun for her. If she understood everything about me, then she would be me. You guys see how this works? If I understood everything about God, I'd be God. That'd be terrible for all of you. We can't understand everything about God, and we have to be okay with that. And I think sometimes we tie ourselves in knots because we can't understand something instead of just saying, well, he hasn't revealed this to me, so I'm just going to have to go on what I know. And really this question about, why did God allow the angels to sin? It's the same question as why did God allow Adam and Eve to sin? It's the same question as why does God allow me to sin? It's the same question as we ask so many other times of, why does God allow bad things to happen? That's the question. And the answer is because he's God. And I don't know all the details, but what I know is that he's writing this amazing story, right? And he chose to make us a part of it. And that's incredible. And at the very heart of this story is his love for us. That's why at the very end in the 1 John it says that God is love. So at the very heart of this story that he's writing is his love for us. I don't know if I can say this in a way that's going to make a lot of sense. I'm going to do my very best. If you can imagine all possible worlds, some worlds, God doesn't give us choices. We just have to do whatever, right? Some worlds, God lets us choose whatever we want, and he doesn't intervene at all. And in our world, God gives us choices, and he intervenes. I would argue that's the best possible world, because that's the only world where we can understand God's love. You see, we can't understand love without sacrifice. You know someone loves you when they sacrifice for you. That's why Jesus said the greatest love of all is a man is willing to give up his life for his friends. So we can't understand love without sacrifice. And so for us to understand God's love for us, like the extent, and we can't fully get it, but for us to understand that it is so immense that we can't fully get it, for us to understand how all-encompassing his love is for us, somehow God has to have a plan, and he's got to write this plan out where he is going to make a sacrifice for us that is unimaginable. Because it's in that sacrifice that we recognize how much he loves us. See, now I'm going to preach. Jesus' sacrifice is the centerpiece of God's story. Because Jesus' sacrifice is where we understand his love. Jesus' sacrifice happens, why? Because we sin. If God doesn't let us sin, then God doesn't need to sacrifice for us, and we don't have a love relationship with our Creator. We have a control relationship. He controls us, that's it. So I would argue that while I can't answer all the questions as to how and why he does what he does and what his motivations are and are not, and maybe when we get to heaven, the lack of our sin will allow us to understand some of these things, what I can understand is the way he's done it makes it possible for me to know him in a way I never could, and to understand that he loves me in a way that I never could. And for that, I'm just grateful. So I don't have an answer to the question. I don't know. I could go on about lots of other things about how God sits outside of time and space, and so he can intervene in our time and space without us actually doing it. That allows us to make choices where he's still in control of our choices and we still suffer the consequences of our choices. And I could talk about all that, but I don't have to, because the main thing is whatever it is that he's writing, it's about love and his love for us, and he's done it the most perfect way possible. Okay? So that's going to be my answer for tonight. Okay, I have to go back to this one. Wrong one. How do I shift my perspective from a worldly perspective of evolution to a godly perspective of creation? All right. Let me first say, I don't think you need to say that it's a worldly versus a godly view, okay? I think creation is right. That's what I think. I think you can be a godly person and not believe that. I think there are lots of godly people who have much different view of creation than I do. So I think that's okay. But if in your heart and in your conscience you're saying, I really want to believe in creation, not evolution, that's probably the Holy Spirit working on you. That's awesome. And what I would say is start reading, start studying, start watching YouTube videos. So I would start with a guy named Frank Turek. So it's Turek, okay? Frank Turek, really powerful speaker about who God is and all that. Now, he has a different view on creation and evolution than I do, okay? He's not as strong on the 6-day literal, but he's very strong on creation. So I'd start there. After that, so this is kind of like baby steps, right? I would look. There's a guy named John Lennox, and I think it's Lennox, and he is a mathematician, and he might be the most brilliant man alive, but he is a Christian, and he is a powerful apologist for God and his existence in creation. And then after that, I'd probably look at some of the stuff from the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter and the stuff Ken Ham has. If you really want to research the book that I put out there, The Genesis Flood is a really good one. But I would just start to read, start to study. Go on YouTube and just say, look for videos about creationism. And just kind of take those in. Honestly, if you train your ChatGPT bot well, you can actually ask it, give me bullet points of the 10 most powerful arguments for a literal 24-hour creation. It'll give you good stuff. So that'd be something else. But I would say read, study, and then as you do that, allow God to change your heart. And maybe just like every day, read Genesis 1 and 2. Just every day. And as you read it, just say, God, I want you to help me to see this for what it is. All right. There's one more question that I skipped. Yeah, if you could just share a little bit about Noah being the new Adam. Okay. So I don't know if I would use that phraseology, some would, because I like to think of Jesus as the new Adam, and I don't want to interfere with that. So, Jesus is a great new Adam, because Adam was tempted and Jesus was tempted, but Jesus didn't sin. Adam was in a garden where he had everything. Jesus was in the wilderness where he had nothing, and Jesus still didn't sin. Right? Adam had Eve with him. Jesus was on his own, and he still didn't sin. So you go on with that, right? So through Adam, sin came into the world, and death through sin. Through Jesus, righteousness came into the world, and life through him. So I like to think of Jesus as the new Adam instead of Noah. But what Noah is, Noah is the new starting point, right? So after the flood, you're starting over. And so everything that's true of Adam in that sense is true of Noah. So you're starting with one gene pool, you're spreading out from there. Unfortunately, Noah's story, similar to Adam's story, he falls into sin, and it messes things up. It causes some problems and curses and all of that. We see that. But also at the end of the day, we know that Noah was a righteous man. And because Noah was a righteous man, the promise to Adam and to Eve is continued through him. And remember, that promise was that through the descendants of Eve, the head of the serpent will be crushed. And so it's through Noah's descendants, it's through his son Shem, and then on from there that we eventually get to Jesus, and he crushes the head of the serpent. So in that sense, Noah is another Adam, that he's the first guy. But I just like Jesus to be the second Adam. That's more fun. All right, I think I'm through the questions. So if I missed yours, I apologize, but I think I'm through the questions. If there's something you want to ask more about, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to interact with you there. I can send you resources if you want to look into some of this stuff more. But thank you guys for coming. Glad you could be here for this. Let me pray, and then I will send you on your way. Father, thank you again for your word. Thank you that it is trustworthy. And Father, thank you that we can have confidence that even when we don't have all the answers, we rely on a God that created everything and knows everything and loves us. And we can trust your love for us. So help us to do that. Father, I pray that you give everybody here a great night, give them safety on the road home. Bring us back together on Sunday for a great day of worshiping and diving back into your word. In your name, amen. All right, guys, thank you for being here. Have a great night. Go USA.